Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Packernet Podcast. I am your host and resident fanalist, as always, Ryan Schlip. Check us out online, Packernet.com. Find me on Twitter, Pack_data. Today's real simple. We're going to do some news and notes, and then we're going to get right back to what we started yesterday, kind of going through and analyzing the roster. So we'll see what comes of that. But that is the plan. Tom Pelissero says 7-time All-Pro guard Zach Martin has informed the Cowboys that he has plans to retire, sources tell the insiders. So, very, very talented guy that has helped prop up that dead bag of bones franchise is leaving, and that makes me laugh. Aaron Rodgers was caught up with by some paparazzi out in California. Essentially was asked, what would it take for you to want to be on somebody's team? And his answer was, for them to want you. Which I suppose points for self-awareness on that one. He did go on to say the second thing was having a good team. So we'll see how that pans out. Another thing here, Benjamin Albright about Aaron Rodgers to the Vikings says, it's not happening at all in any way, shape, or form. He said he would retire from his job if Rodgers was to land in Minnesota. So I will take that as a consolation for sure. But finally, I want to look at this. This is Matt Okada from NFL.com went through and looked at some cut candidates. Again, most of these we already know, but there's a couple interesting ones on here. A lot of it really just has to do with fire sale type teams, but I want to cover a couple of these. So, there's a couple that are listed as or, which I find interesting, but it says for the New York Jets, Davante Adams or Allen Lazard. I would have assumed both, but I suppose you need bodies on your team. I don't think Davante stays no matter what. It's just a question of, are they going to want to keep Lazard? If they're keeping one of them, I'm guessing they're keeping Lazard, but because again, Davante's not staying. I don't think. I think he just wants to get the heck out of there. He only went there because he thought he and Rodgers could do something special, and that obviously fell apart, and so now it's time to go find something better. But I thought that was a little interesting. This one was very interesting. I had mentioned before how the Chiefs are giving Travis Kelce a timeline, basically saying, I don't remember what it was like March something, March 14th maybe, you have until this date to give us an answer on whether you're coming back or not. Usually not the way you handle superstars, to just say, give me an answer or else. But they did. Now, we have this. Travis Kelce is on the list. It says, yes, this is absurd, cutting a future first ballot Hall of Famer and arguably the greatest playoff pass catcher in NFL history. Nonsense, right? Well, not necessarily. Assuming Travis Kelce doesn't retire this spring, the Chiefs could possibly restructure his contract to make it work until he does hang up his cleats. But it's not impossible that they let him go for a whopping $17.3 million in cap savings. Considering the 35-year-old has now posted consecutive seasons with fewer than 1,000 yards and had just 8 receiving touchdowns in 2023 and 2024 combined, not counting playoffs, of course, Kelce's efficiency has plummeted these last 2 years, and it might be time for Kansas City to move on if he doesn't do so himself. Again, this would be crazy, but Kansas City has split with legendary tight ends amid solid production before. See Tony Gonzalez. Let's also remember that they got rid of Tyreek Hill, who was sort of there's no way they would let him walk kind of a person. So that's interesting. Not only is it possible he could retire, but even if he says, I do want to come back, there's a possibility that the Chiefs would let him go. So we got another out for not seeing Travis Kelce in Kansas City again. Similarly, Mark Andrews, tight end for the Baltimore Ravens. Now, I know tight end is not our biggest need in the world, but there are certain people that, regardless of the position, you look at and go, we should at least talk about it. Says immediate disclaimer, I think this is very unlikely. The chemistry between Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews is too tight, and Andrews scored 11 touchdowns over Baltimore's last 12 regular season games. However, this article covers potential, and there is a sliver of potential here. Despite the touchdowns, the veteran tight end was clearly less effective in 2024, averaging 3.2 receptions and 39.6 yards per game, both his lowest career marks outside of his rookie season. The Ravens have another young pass-catching tight end in Isaiah Likely. Cutting Andrews ahead of a contract year would save $11 million for the franchise not currently in the greatest cap shape. And of course, there was the playoff collapse. Still, Andrews is a core piece of the offense and locker room, so I don't expect him to go anywhere in 2025. You also have to ask the question of possibly trading, which would make it more appealing to the Ravens if they're recognizing they need to get out of it and they're saying, well, we're not going to cut him, but what if somebody threw a little bit something at him? If they're looking at it saying, we're not getting rid of him, but we're pretty sure he'll be gone by next year, and somebody's willing to throw I don't know, what if I sweeten the deal with a 6th-round pick or something, a conditional? Now you get to shave the money off your books, you get picks in return, and you're doing what's going to be the case next year anyway. Just a thought. Another one that's very interesting and would seem unlikely, but interesting just the same, Joey Bosa of the Chargers. Joey Bosa made the list last season, but the Chargers decided to keep both him and Khalil Mack and move on from Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. They did restructure Bosa's contract, the ideal scenario I laid out in 2024 column, but here we are again heading into 2025. Los Angeles could save $25.4 million against the cap by cutting Bosa, who did make the Pro Bowl again the most recent season, but still has not rediscovered the double-digit sack from earlier in his career. He had just 5 in 2024. Mack will be a free agent this March, adding a wrinkle to the situation, and the Chargers are currently in the top 5 in cap space, so maybe Bosa sticks around for another year, but he's on the watch list. Now, it makes sense insofar as I don't know how much more Bosa has to offer the Chargers. I guess that's a weird way to put it. He's on the back end of his career. He's going to turn 30 this year, and he had his worst year in 2024. So, again, injuries, right? He was great week 1 and 2, and then he got hurt in week 3, and it was all downhill from there. So that's probably why. But again, 30 years old, coming off an injury, and we're talking saving $25 million. If you were maybe a little closer to being a Super Bowl contender, you could argue that it would make sense to continue it, but it's worth talking about. The biggest thing for me, though, is the fact that Khalil Mack is a free agent. Are you really going to get rid of Keenan Allen and Mike Williams and then the very next year get rid of Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa? I mean, that's psychotic behavior. The only other option would be to release Joey Bosa and sign Khalil Mack, and I think that makes even less sense because Khalil Mack is, 5 years older than Joey Bosa, and he's not under contract, so you'd have to cut one guy and then give the other guy a contract. Why don't you just keep Bosa and get rid of Khalil Mack? It would just be kind of a weird thing. So either you get rid of both of them or you cut Bosa and then sign Khalil Mack back. I don't see how that makes any sense. For the Cincinnati Bengals, we talked about Sam Hubbard being an option, but it says Sam Hubbard or Sheldon Rankins. Neither are massively appealing to me necessarily, but it does kind of point to the fire sale the Cincinnati Bengals might be having. We've already talked about their one premier pass rusher. On top of that, they might be looking at either in addition to or in lieu of another edge rusher in Hubbard or a defensive tackle. Talked about Von Miller, Christian Kirk, Alex Kappa already. Those are the couple we've already discussed. Raekwon Davis I had mentioned. He's with the Colts right now. Zero interest from a serious standpoint, aside from the fact that I really liked him in college, but that's irrelevant. But it says Raekwon Davis or Samson Ebukam. Ebukam is another edge rusher. Again, he's for the Colts. He's going on 30 years old and missed the entire 2024 season because he had a torn Achilles injury during training camp in 2024. There is some slight appeal, though. When you look at some of his statistics over the last 2023, 2022, he's above 10%. In fact, 2023 was his best year by far. He had an 80 run defense grade, 73 pass rush grade, 76 coverage grade, 84 overall, 48 pressures and 10 sacks on 450 attempts. It's not the worst thing in the world. However, again, 30 years old. He's 245, so he's pretty small. But, as I've said before, add more people to the pool. It's not going to hurt. They also list Denico Autry, edge rusher for the Houston Texans. Dude's beyond old and washed up. John Franklin Myers, defensive end for the Broncos. Dalvin Tomlinson, defensive tackle for the Browns. That's just the AFC side. Obviously, the more likely side, considering we're NFC. On the NFC side of things, Deebo Samuel, Marshawn Lattimore. Deebo, we've talked about, very unlikely to come to Green Bay, almost zero chance, in fact. Marshawn Lattimore is a little bit more interesting. He got shipped off to Washington halfway through the year last year, and it didn't go super well. Actually, I don't even know if he was shipped off. I don't know how this all happened exactly. I don't care to look it up, but it was his one kind of down year. But even if you disregard that, he's been very up and down. In fact, over the last 5 seasons prior to this season, via PFF, he's had really one good year, depending on how you want to splice it. If you're looking at his coverage grades, 2021 was a 76, 2022 was a 70, 2023 was basically a 70. So it's not terrible. It's good enough. At 28.7 years old, you could possibly talk me into Marshawn Lattimore as a stopgap, but I don't super love Lattimore. I think he's better than everybody we have, but I also think the Packers would probably need some more work. So again, it would depend on the price. I have a feeling his namesake, Marshawn Lattimore, is a big name, probably going to command a decent amount of money. I don't really know. But if he does become available, which he may because he had a bad year last year, he only played a handful of games for Washington, and he's going to cost $18 million against the cap. They're not in a bad cap situation, but they might just look at it and go, this is not worth the money to us. Cam Jordan, we already talked about. Derek Carr is not interesting. Tyler Lockett is somewhat interesting, if only because we've been talking constantly about DK Metcalf, DK Metcalf, DK Metcalf. Then we went over the news that the offensive coordinator basically came in and said, oh, no, I've got a very specific plan for DK Metcalf. Now, Metcalf can still say, screw you, I want out of here. But it doesn't sound like they're supremely interested in moving on from Metcalf. And now that you see Tyler Lockett on this list, it's like, wait a minute, what happened to DK Metcalf? It says Seattle is currently projected $13.5 million over the cap, the fourth worst mark in the league for a 5-year stretch. For a 5-year stretch, Tyler Lockett was one of the more underrated receivers. But since 2023, the veteran has averaged 747 yards, 4 touchdowns. With the 2024 breakout of Jackson Smith-Njigba and the presence of DK Metcalf, it would seem that 32-year-old Lockett's declining services are no longer needed. I don't think the Packers would have any interest in Tyler Lockett. DK, yes, but if it's DK and Jackson Smith-Njigba, which would make more sense, staying, then it would be Tyler Lockett kind of on the outs, and I think that makes significantly more sense. For the Falcons, they have 2 defensive tackles, so somebody coming out of there. It says David Onyemata or Grady Jarrett, which we have talked about that already. They have Jonah Jackson, offensive guard for the Rams. Jonah Jackson was a long-time Detroit Lion. Really pretty piss-poor pass blocking, but decent run blocking. He's sort of the anti-Green Bay Packer, but I just don't really expect the Packers to have any interest in that. For the Chicago Bears, hilariously, they have Tremaine Edmonds or TJ Edwards. I'm glad to hear this. Let's read a little bit about it. It says the Bears are currently projected to have $63 million in cap space, but they also have a lot of work to do to build around Caleb this offseason, in hopes that they can take another step under Ben Johnson's tutelage. That might mean saving money in certain areas to reallocate it where it matters most. As such, middle linebackers Tremaine Edmonds and TJ Edwards could be cut considerations. Edmonds carries a $17.4 million cap hit, though $13 million of that would remain dead money unless he was designated post-June 1, and $6.8 in cap relief wouldn't take effect until June, negating the benefits in free agency. Edwards is easier to move on from, with the potential release resulting in $5.5 million in savings. They were second and third in tackles for the Bears last season, but both earned middling defensive grades from PFF. If Chicago's front, blah, 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 blah. First of all, I just find this funny because they went out and just paid a bunch of money for linebackers, and now they're talking about possibly getting rid of them because they're not that good anyways. Edwards would be the one that I'm probably more interested in if we were to go in a certain direction. If he were to be cut and if we were to get somebody, I just like TJ Edwards and I don't like Tremaine Edmonds. Plus, I just don't think Edmonds would make sense for what we need. Maybe Edwards doesn't either. I don't really know, but I know Edmonds doesn't. Either way, it would be funny. Noah Fant, tight end for the Seattle Seahawks. Miles Sanders, running back for Carolina. Philadelphia, it says cornerbacks Darius Slay or James Bradbury. That's interesting based on yesterday saying they had maybe the best cornerback group. The interesting thing is the reason that they can do this is because they drafted Quinion Mitchell and Cooper DeJean last year, and both of them are like number 1 corners. So that sucks. Taysom Hill, could possibly bring him back. That would be fun. Gerald Everett, Bears tight end, Roy Robertson Harris, defensive tackle for Seattle, and Darius Williams, cornerback for the LA Rams. Another person that I just really don't have a lot of interest in. He's definitely had some ups as far as his career, but coming off a really bad year, going on 32 years old, just not really interested. All right, let's take a break. We'll come back, and I want to go through our wide receivers. Again, if you didn't listen to yesterday, first of all, just do it, and then come on back. But we're going to look at wide receiver 1, 2, 3, and 4, and see where our guys rank compared to the rest of the NFL. We'll take a break. We'll be right back. All right, so looking at wide receiver is actually kind of interesting. So I think all of us agree on a couple things, but we may need to shift it even a little bit further. So we've all come to the agreement that the Packers do not have really any wide receiver ones. Now, you could technically squeeze them into the very bottom end of being a number one, but, you know, in terms of, like, if you had to put them in an official category, where would they be, 1, 2, 3, or 4? We don't have a 1. I think most of us felt, though, that we had a bunch of 2s, and I don't know that that's exactly correct. I think we're right in assuming that the back end is solid, the depth is solid, and it is. The Packers, you know, the further in the depth chart you get, the more, the higher we rank, because it's not as good on the front end, but it's better on the back end. But it needs to shift further back than I think that we had thought. So let's go through this. This, right off the bat, this kind of shocked me. So first of all, let's just look at the Green Bay Packers. Undo this one. So the Green Bay Packers wide receivers, the top 4 in terms of actual targets, and this was kind of interesting to me, but just looking at the 4 that we're actually going to look at, Dontavian Wicks was targeted the most. I didn't realize that. Then Jaden Reed, then Romeo Doubs, then Christian Watson. Those are the 4. Now, that's not surprising. The order is surprising. Which 4 is not surprising. In terms of the grades, they're all bunched up very close. In fact, the top 3 are almost identical. Jaden Reed, 71.7. This is their overall PFF grade. Romeo Doubs, 69.7. Christian Watson, 69.1. And then a drop-off for Wicks at 65.1. Still very close, but not basically touching like the other 3. Now, I would have been very comfortable saying that these are all a bunch of wide receiver 2s. Maybe Wicks is closer to a 3, but I don't know. So this very first part kind of just surprised me in and of itself. Just looking at the wide receiver 1. Do you know where our wide receiver 1, which in this case is Jaden Reed, ranks among wide receiver 1s? There's a lot of really good wide receiver. And we kind of talked about that wide receivers are hitting at a pretty high rate as of the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, something like that. Do you know where he ranks? 71.7 grade is ranked 31st. Only the New England Patriots' number 1 wide receiver at a 70 is lower. 31st ranked number 1 wide receiver. I knew we didn't have a very good top end. I didn't think it was 31st. But do you know where our wide receiver 2 ranks? It's not as bad. Like I said, it just keeps getting better. But our wide receiver 2, which in this case is Romeo Doubs, you would think we have a pretty solid number 2. We don't. He ranks 20th. Not even, we're removing every single wide receiver 1 from the equation and just looking at wide receiver 2s, he ranks 20th. In fact, Jaden Reed as a wide receiver 2 would rank 17th, which is to say, as a wide receiver 2, our number 1 wide receiver would be on the lower half, wouldn't even be in the top half of wide receiver 2s. It's very close. But the 16th ranked wide receiver 2 has a 71.8 grade. Jaden Reed is 71.7. The top wide receiver 2 is Tampa Bay with an 86.3. We don't have anybody even close to that. Then, if we look at our wide receiver 3, who is Christian Watson, now we're starting to see where the depth is paying off. We have the 7th highest graded wide receiver 3 in the NFL. Only Washington, Seattle, Detroit, LA, Indianapolis, and Houston have higher wide receiver 3s. And then finally, Wicks as a wide receiver 4 is the 4th highest graded wide receiver 4. Only Houston, Washington, and Detroit are higher. But then I broke it down a little bit more. What if we started looking at them in groups? So if you're just looking at your top two receivers, in this case would be Romeo Doubs and Jaden Reed. The Green Bay Packers wide receiver group ranks 27th. Only Chicago, Cleveland, Tennessee, Las Vegas, and New England are worse, which, by the way, can I just point out how hilarious it is that Chicago loaded up? They went too heavy at wide receiver, and they have one of the worst wide receiver groups in the entire NFL, which we'll look at in a second. It's hilarious that after all of that, they have one of the worst wide receiver groups. Just hilarious. If we look at the top three, the trio, which you would assume is better, which it is, you'd assume it's a lot better, our top three receivers rank 20th. You know, you look at teams and you say, okay, a lot of teams probably have a good wide receiver, but there's probably a pretty big drop-off. We don't have as big of a drop-off. So you would think when you start putting three into the mix, we would rank at least top half. We don't. 20th. And then finally, if you look at all four, we finally make it in the top half, but only barely. We rank 15th when you look at all four receivers together. 15th. Looking at the wide receiver groups, Detroit, first of all, is the second highest. So speaking of value, right, if you wanted to make a case for it, here's Detroit. Their top four receivers have an average of 75.4. Our highest graded receiver has a 71.7. Their average across four receivers is a 75. Houston is the highest with a 77. LA, 75. Seattle, 73. Tampa, 73. Indy, 72. Washington, 72. Minnesota, 71.9. Atlanta, 71.8. Cincinnati, 71.2. And then finally, Baltimore, 70.8. So there are 10 teams whose average across four receivers are higher than our number one. Actually, that's not true. I was wrong about the 71. It would be 9. 9 receivers. 71.8 Atlanta. So Minnesota, who ranks 8th, across four receivers, has a 71.95. We have a 71.7 in Jaden Reed. Now, they only have one receiver that's higher, but when Justin Jefferson's on the team and you have decent enough depth, that their 4 is worse than our 4. Their 3 is almost the same, but slightly worse than our 3. But you add Justin Jefferson, and then your number 2 is also graded out higher than our number 1. Yeah, you're going to end up with a pretty high average. Now, again, the real benefit here is when we assume that we plug in a bigger number. Let's just take, for example, Davante, real quick. Davante, by the way, not super highly graded among wide receiver ones. He wasn't even the wide receiver one. Garrett Wilson was. But he had a 75.8. The benefit, though, again, is that you just kind of push people down. Now, it's kind of a weird situation of who it's going to be if Romeo Doubs ends up leaving or whatever. But for now, let's just leave that alone. So So Davante has a 75.8. That's not super high. It's actually pretty low among number 1 wide receivers. In fact, you can argue it's not really much of a wide receiver one. It would rank, let's see here, 75.8 would be 26th, be the 26th highest. So it's really not even a wide receiver 1. It's a very low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2. But again, the benefit is just kind of pushing everybody down. So what would that do if we did that? So our wide receiver 1 would rank 26th, which isn't great. But now our wide receiver 2 ranks 17th. Still not the greatest, but it's significantly better. Our wide receiver 3 would rank 6th. And our wide receiver 4 would be number 1 in the NFL. If you look at our top 2 wide receivers, as sad as it is, we're still not very good, but it's 23rd. If you look at the top 3 receivers, we're up to 16th. And then if you look at the wide receiver group as a whole, we're officially top 10, but we're 10th. So the really unfortunate thing is you go get a guy like Davante. He's a pretty good player. He's got a 76 PFF grade. It still barely gets us in the top 10. Our top 2 receivers are still not that great. And the reason being, again, Davante isn't really even super in the top conversation. It's crazy, but I mean, if you look at the middle of the pack, if you want to get halfway up the ladder, at 16, it's an 82 PFF grade. 82. So the best path probably is through the draft and to hope that you get very lucky. And let's say we do get to an 82 PFF grade. If you get an 82, we'll just plop him in there. That would put us at, it would be 17th behind, it's tied, 16th, 17th. We already did the wide receiver 2, 3, 4 because everything stays the same. But our top 2 receivers now would be 14th. Our top 3 receivers would be 11th, and our top 4 receivers would be top 5 in the NFL. So, I mean, look, again, PFF grades are not the be-all, end-all in the function of getting a true X receiver and all that stuff. Guy with good hands and whatnot. It's important. I just, couple things. Number one, the importance of getting a receiver is magnified. However, the odds of getting an actual receiver that is going to be beneficial are much lower in my mind. The fact that Davante Adams barely moves the needle, and it's largely because there's so many already good receivers in the NFL. I mean, our 4 wide receivers, the average across 4, goes from a 71 to a 73 if we added Davante Adams, and that's assuming Davante plays the same. I mean, he's been regressing, since 2022. He went, or actually since 2021, went from a 93 to a 90 to a 79 to a 76. If he drops even further, how much value actually is there? Actually, I'm sorry, it's a 69 to a 71, something like that. It doesn't move the needle very much. Now, of the possibilities, as far as, what could the Packers do, T. Higgins was ranked 6th with an 88 PFF grade. He's probably not leaving Cincinnati. They're trying to franchise tag him, but that is a thing. Mike Evans was the 3rd highest graded. Chris Godwin only played 7 games but had an 86 PFF grade. And Stephon Diggs is a little bit lower than what you're looking for, but had a 79. Garrett Wilson with a 79 also, if you're able to kind of pluck him away. But as far as people that are even, there's a shred of belief that they could be available. That's about it. Otherwise, you're trying to hit a home run in the draft and find the next, Amon-Ra, Puka Nacua. And last year was a decent year. There were 3 guys, Brian Thomas, Ladd McConkey, and Malik Neighbors, that all hit that threshold. But that means everybody else was a miss. So if you tried it last year, Marvin Harrison did not make it. Xavier Worthy did not. Keon Coleman, Roma Dunze, not even close. He was at a 64. Ricky Pearsall, Xavier Legette, Adonai Mitchell, Troy Franklin. A lot of names that people were excited about that coulda, woulda, maybe could possibly do something. Nothing. Does seem to be kind of a young man's game, though, because you got 4 more just from the year before. Jackson Smith and Jigba, Zay Flowers, Josh Downs, and Puka Nacua. So, 2023, 2024 makes up about 7 of the top, 15, 16, half. And almost all of them come from 2021 through 2024, the last 4 years. Jackson Smith and Jigba, Devontae Smith, Brian Thomas, Zay Flowers, Chris Olave, Ladd McConkey, Josh Downs, Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors, Drake London, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Nico Collins, and Puka Nacua. So, what do you do? Is the answer to go get Davante Adams, who for the last 2 years has not had an 80 PFF grade? And almost everybody in that group is a first-round pick. There's several options of non-first-round picks, but Josh Downs, first or second, I guess. Josh Downs was a 3rd. Amon-Ra 4th, Nico Collins 3rd, and Puka Nacua 5th. But, a lot of first-round picks here. So, maybe you get lucky, Maybe you get lucky. Ladd McConkey was a second-round pick, but he was 34, so he was basically, one of the first second-round picks. He was basically a first-round pick. Unless you get massively lucky, And the Packers don't have the 34th pick. So, I mean, if you're going to take one of these guys, it's got to be with your first pick unless you trade down. Unless you find a Puka Nacua or an Amon-Ra St. Brown. The first-round picks have been hitting. They've been hitting a lot. Outside of that, not nearly as much. I hate to go down the, we have to do this road. I'm just looking at the information, and I'm saying, a lot of times picks miss. It happens, but just with wide receiver recently, there's been a ton of hits in the first round at the position. And not just like decent enough, because there's a lot of guys that are decent. And I mean, Marvin Harrison and Jalen Coker, Xavier Worthy, Devon Vele, Keon Coleman. Those are decent rookie seasons. I would consider those hits. Tank Dell, Jordan Addison, Jaden Reed, Demario Douglas, Marvin Mims, certainly could count those as hits. I'm talking about like really, really, really good. Khalil Shakir, Garrett Wilson, George Pickens, Jamison Williams, Alec Pierce, Rashid Shaheed, Romeo Dobbs, Christian Watson. Sure, you put those in the hits category. But, I mean, look at how many are not only hits, but are top 20 in the NFL. Just saying. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll do a little bit of NFL draft. We'll be right back. So I guess for the draft, kind of trying to stick with the theme of just elaborating on it, it's tough because the conclusion essentially is we need higher top end. So it doesn't do a lot of good to look at third, fourth, fifth round prospects. The one thing I was curious about, though, is when you look at not just the consensus big board, but the individual big boards, is Teteroa McMillan the consensus is the wrong, is it the unanimous number one? Are there other people that have higher wide receivers, and if so, who and how high? Because the question is it Teteroa McMillan or bust? Not to say that, somebody couldn't pan out. Justin Jefferson wasn't the first wide receiver taken in that draft class. You never know. But, last year there was a good amount of debate about who's the top. And, Marvin Harrison was seen as the top. But there was a lot of like, I don't know, dude, Malik Neighbors is a little better and that kind of thing. It is almost unanimous. I finally, across these big boards that I did find, you got Connor Rogers over at NBC. We got Dane Brugler of The Athletic. We got Trevor Sikkema at Pro Football Focus. 33rd Team's Kyle Krabs. I pulled Draft Tech, a couple different PFFs, staff PFF, as well as, Chris Trapasso, CBS, NFL.com's Daniel Jeremiah, Walter Cherepinski. Actually, is this Charlie Campbell or Walter? This is Charlie Campbell. Pro Football Network's Dalton Miller, and then finally, this thing really is just super slow, Mike Renner at CBS. So I grabbed all of those, and there were two that did not have Teteroa McMillan as the top. Mike Renner of CBS has Luther Burden one spot ahead of him at 10, with Teteroa McMillan at 11. And then Dalton Miller over at Pro Football Network has a little bit more of a gap, but not really. Luther Burden at 10, Teteroa McMillan at 12. Everybody else not only has him number one, but some of the rankings are kind of crazy. So Charlie Campbell has him at 4, as in the 4th best prospect in the entire draft. Daniel Jeremiah has Teteroa McMillan the top at 15, which I think is the lowest I've seen. Chris Trapasso at CBS has him number 5 overall. Pro Football Focus has him number 3 overall. It's Travis Hunter, then Abdul Carter, then Teteroa McMillan, which is crazy. 33rd Team has him 14, again, on the low end. Draft Tech, number 3 overall. Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter, then Teteroa McMillan. Trevor Sikkema over at PFF has him number 3 overall. Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter, Teteroa McMillan. The Athletic's Dane Brugler has him number 7 overall. Connor Rogers over at NBC Sports has him 10 overall. And I think that's the last one. So Again, I don't know where he's going to end up. It's feeling more and more like he's going to go early just based on, if this many people see him as top 5 and even top 3, there's got to be a lot of teams that view him similarly, and he's not going to make it anywhere close. I would assume he'd have to make it comfortably out of the top 10 before the Packers would consider trading up for a guy. I think best case scenario, you start to see a run on guys like Luther Burden. Maybe the Jackson Smith and Jigba thing will get people a little bit more excited about Emeka Egbuka. And so that could maybe push a guy like McMillan down, possibly, especially if there just isn't a ton of need for wide receiver, which would make sense because there's a lot of edge rushers and there's, at least a couple quarterbacks. And you got Mason Graham and you've got, corners like Travis Hunter and Will Johnson. The premier positions, and then you got the tackle run starting probably around late top 10 for sure with Chicago. These are premium positions: tackle, edge, corner, quarterback. Wide receivers probably right there, but I'm hopeful that some of these things, maybe with a one-off wide receiver going first, aside from McMillan, that could push him into the 12, 13, 14 category. I did say Dallas at 12, it's going to be really hard to get past, but maybe that's the team that takes another wide receiver. If he slips past that, starts to get to 14, 15. Not saying it's, and again, I'm not saying this is necessarily what I want. I'm just thinking, based on what we're doing today with wide receiver, if there is that dude that's going to be the breakout star, who is it going to be? And pretty close to unanimously, the answer is Teteroa McMillan. There is some Luther Burden talk out there. Again, my concern with Burden and Egbuka is whether or not they're just truly slot guys, in which case I don't think the Packers would go that direction, which pushes it even further into the Teteroa McMillan conversation, because, it's kind of, I don't want to say that or bust, but it's that or you better hope one of these other guys that are seen as more second-round prospects really do pan out. That, a guy like maybe Jaden Higgins or something, Matthew Golden, whatever. But we've kind of already gone through some of the potential first-round picks that kind of have the qualities that you'd be looking for in an X receiver. Told you about Trey Harris, who I'm a fan of, and whatnot. So probably just leave it at that for now. You guys have a good rest of your day. We have 0 calls, so I get the day off, which is fantastic. But be sure to get your calls in, 608-501-0718. New callers go directly to the front of the line. So go ahead and do that. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.